2,000 years, mathematicians have used and listed prime numbers, but their pattern still evades them.
For over 2,000 years, a mathematical riddle has baffled the world's greatest minds. It's such a difficult problem that it's tormented those mathematicians brave enough to tackle it. Some have given up in despair, others have been driven mad, or even to attempt suicide. Yet it's a conundrum that played a part in Britain's victory over Nazi Germany, that was instrumental in the birth of the computer, and that has shed light on the behaviour of atoms, the building blocks of matter itself. Today, the entire online financial world depends upon its impenetrable nature. A solution could well bring the financial world to its knees. It's hardly surprising that a prize of $1 million has been offered to whoever cracks it. But what is this holy grail of mathematics? The mystery that has confounded mathematicians for centuries is the riddle of prime numbers. It is the greatest unsolved problem of mathematics, and whoever cracks it will achieve immortality. This is the story of those who have tried to capture the music of the primes.
It's 7 o'clock on Tuesday the 6th.
We're surrounded by numbers. They're everywhere we go. We often don't realise it, but numbers are part of the fabric of our lives. Numbers help us to understand the world around us. And numbers help us to communicate.
We have a 17, 73, and 101.
And numbers are the dynamo that powers our modern way of life. When we travel by car, or by plane, when we watch TV, or play a CD, when we pick up a phone, or cook a meal, we depend on maths.
Red 18, blue 43, white 65, red 14.
Without maths, none of these things would exist. Quite simply, numbers are essential to our daily lives. But the most important of all the numbers in mathematics are the prime numbers. House.
But what are prime numbers? And why are they so important? Well, every child is taught the basics about primes.
A prime number is a number which is only divisible by itself and 1.
But what children aren't taught is why these indivisible numbers are so important. They're the building blocks of maths. All numbers that aren't prime can be built by multiplying primes together. So the number 105, for example, can be produced by multiplying the prime 3, by the prime 5, by the prime 7.
Every number can be broken down into its prime constituents. From primes you get numbers, from numbers you get mathematics, and from mathematics you get the whole of science. The primes are the hydrogen and oxygen of the world of numbers. They're the atoms of mathematics.
It's no wonder that mathematicians have always been fascinated by them.
My favorite prime number is 163.
17.
19.
Oh, I guess 163.
2. Why? Oh, because it's so odd, because it's the only one that's even.
Primes are so fundamental that nature became aware of them long before we ever did. In the forests of North America, there's a species of cicada that have used the primes in their fight for evolutionary survival. For 17 years, these insects live underground, doing absolutely nothing except feeding on tree roots. Then, after 17 years of silence, they emerge into the forest for a 6-week party. The sound that they make is so loud, it drives the locals crazy. The cicadas eat, have sex, lay eggs, and after 6 weeks, they die. The forest falls silent for another 17 years.
But why have the cicadas chosen 17 years to stay underground? Well, it seems as though they once had a predator that used to like to crash their party. Now, the predator also used to appear periodically in the forest. The cicadas discovered that if they chose a prime number life cycle, they could keep out of sync with the predator for as long as possible. The primes are quite literally the key to the cicada's survival.
The first people to really understand the significance of the primes were the ancient Greeks. They laid the foundations that mathematicians have been building upon ever since. And they realised that the primes were the building blocks of maths. The libraries and academies of ancient Greece began to fill with tables recording ever higher prime numbers.
Perhaps some ancient Greek mathematician thought he could make his name by writing down all the primes in some huge table. But around 300 BC, Euclid, the first genius of mathematics, discovered that this was impossible. He explained why anyone who tried to write down all the primes would be counting forever. He proved without a doubt that there's an infinite number of prime numbers, and he did so by an ingenious piece of logical reasoning.
Euclid asked if it was possible that there were in fact a finite number of primes which could be multiplied together to produce every other number. So he took, say, the list of primes 2 and 3 and 5. Could every number be built by multiplying different combinations of 2s, 3s and 5s? Euclid concocted a way to build a number that could never be captured by these 3 prime numbers. He began by multiplying together his list of primes. It makes 30. Then, and this was his act of genius, he added 1 to this number to make 31. None of the primes 2, 3 or 5 on his list would divide into it exactly. You always got remainder 1.
Now, Euclid knew that every number can be built by multiplying primes together. So what about 31? Well, since it can't be divided by 2, 3 or 5, there must be some primes missing from the list. Actually, 31 is a prime, so Euclid's found one of the missing primes. But even if Euclid adds 31 to the list, he can still play the same trick. However big the table, he can always show that there are primes missing from the list. Therefore, Euclid's proved there's an infinite number of primes.
Euclid's proof is a wonderful piece of mathematical reasoning. But there was one thing that he couldn't figure out. Euclid had no way of predicting which numbers were prime. He couldn't see any pattern which might help him to predict where to find the primes. If you imagine the numbers laid out on a straight line, the way the primes fall seems to be entirely haphazard.
They appear completely random. So they appear like numbers that appear in the lottery or arrival times of buses in heavy traffic.
The question is there any order to them? Is there a way that we can understand them, if not totally, at least understand them enough so as to see the type of patterns that they force on mathematics?
When you first try to make predictions about when a prime is going to occur, or if you look for simple formulas, as people will do, then they're always wrong.
Like the infinity of stars in the night sky, the primes appear scattered randomly through the universe of numbers. Some are clustered close together, others are flung far apart. There just doesn't seem to be any pattern. It doesn't make sense. And if there's one thing a mathematician craves, it's pattern and sense.
Everyone thinks that maths is all about doing long division to a lot of decimal places and adding things up. But that misses the true essence of what it means to be a mathematician. Above all else, for me, a mathematician is a pattern searcher. Maths is about trying to find patterns in the chaos of numbers around us, trying to find the music that binds these numbers together. And of all the numbers in mathematics, it's the primes which offer the ultimate challenge to the pattern searcher.
This problem of the pattern, or the apparent lack of pattern, in the primes has perplexed mathematicians ever since the time of Euclid. It's outwitted the greatest mathematical minds of the last 2,000 years. It wasn't until the late 18th century that a breakthrough finally happened. It was made by a 15-year-old German boy who grew up to be one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived. Carl Friedrich Gauss.
Gauss became an overnight star thanks, appropriately enough, to astronomy. A newly discovered planet, Ceres, had disappeared from the night sky, drowned out by the sun's glare. Astronomers despaired, but Gauss managed to find a mathematical pattern in Ceres' flight path and pointed astronomers to where they'd find their missing planet. Sure enough, there it was, just as the mathematics had predicted.
But Gauss wasn't only fascinated by stars. Numbers were his true passion.
Gauss was very much a child prodigy. He computed and computed and computed. He said that he could actually compute before he could read. So he lived from numbers virtually from his earliest days on.
By the age of 3, Gauss was correcting his father's arithmetic. As a schoolboy, he began to keep a secret diary of his mathematical discoveries. But it was a present he was given for his 15th birthday that was to change the course of mathematical history. The gift was a book of mathematical tables. At the back of the book was a list which began to obsess the young Gauss. A table of prime numbers. He spent hours poring over these tables, trying to force them to reveal their secrets. Eventually, his efforts led to an amazing discovery. Looking at his table of primes, the 15-year-old Gauss realised, like the generations of mathematicians before him, that there was no pattern to these numbers, no way of predicting where they would pop up. The primes seemed to occur as randomly as the winning numbers on a roulette wheel.
But then Gauss executed one of the classic moves in the mathematician's arsenal. When things get too complicated, do some lateral thinking. Think of the problem in a new way. Ask a new question. Instead of trying to predict precisely which number is prime, Gauss asked instead how many primes there are.
Euclid had established that there were infinitely many primes. Gauss started counting how many primes there were, up to 10, up to 100, up to 1,000, and so on. As he counted higher and higher, the primes seemed to be getting rarer and rarer. But was there some way to predict how they thinned out? For Gauss, the way the primes fell looked as random as the throw of the dice.
But as Gauss counted his primes, he realised that he could calculate the probability of getting a prime. So, for example, there are 25 primes in the numbers from 1 to 100. So that means there's a 1 in 4 chance of getting a prime. But in the numbers from 1 to 1,000, there's only a 1 in 6 chance of getting a prime. So perhaps nature chose the primes by using a set of prime number dice.
But could Gauss predict the number of sides on the dice as nature chose bigger and bigger primes? As he counted higher and higher, working out the prime probability, Gauss began to see a pattern emerging. Despite the randomness of the primes, a stunning regularity seemed to be looming out of the mist. Each time he added a naught, Gauss realised the proportion of primes was going down by the same amount, by about 2. So from 10,000 to 100,000 to 1,000,000, the chance of getting a prime goes down from 1 in 8 to 1 in 10 down to 1 in 12. So, if I want to count primes around 10,000, I need to use an 8-sided dice. But if I want to count primes around 1,000,000, then I've got to use a 12-sided dice. It was as if nature was choosing the primes with a dice whose sides were growing in a very uniform way as she chose bigger and bigger primes.
He discovered a great regularity. As your numbers get bigger and bigger, primes tend to thin out, and he discovered at what rate they're thinning out.
When Gauss mapped the number of primes on a graph, it went up in a jagged progression, a bit like a staircase, making a jump every time he got a new prime. But he could only climb so far. Using his prime number dice, Gauss could produce a second graph which estimated the staircase of the primes as it climbed off to infinity. But rather than concentrating on the details of each individual jump, Gauss's graph tried to predict the overall trend in the staircase. And Gauss believed that the average number of primes decreased with a beautiful regularity. Here was the first evidence of some pattern in the primes. Previous generations had listened to the primes one by one, note by note, unable to hear the full composition. But by looking at the bigger picture, Gauss could hear the dominant theme of the music of the primes. Gauss knew that his guess was only a rough estimate for the number of primes, but he believed that it would never be too far off. However, Gauss couldn't prove it. And proof, for a mathematician, is everything.
Proof is everything, really. It's the one place in the world where it feels like you can actually get to the truth of something.
The beauty of mathematics is once you've determined something to be true, it's true forever. Has no cultural significance in terms of its truth. It's not just true because of a model we have of the world. It's true forever, and that's one of the attractions for many people into mathematics.
Gauss kept his discovery secret until much later in his life. He was always hesitant about publishing his ideas. Instead, Gauss hid his findings in his secret notebook.
There were two reasons why Gauss didn't publish his material. First of all, he was employed as an astronomer, and so being a mathematician was a second job. The astronomer was the day job, if one can use that phrase for an astronomer. The second thing is that Gauss was somebody who never published things until he was absolutely certain that they were perfect.
The results Gauss did publish established him as one of the giants of mathematics.
He's called the Prince of Mathematicians, and that's partly because of the quality of his contributions and partly because of the wide range that they spanned. And he was a physicist too. He was interested in electromagnetism, he was interested in whether space was flat or curved, extreme wide-ranging, as well as this very abstract number theory.
But as he grew older, Gauss became more withdrawn and reclusive. He cloistered himself away in the observatory at the small university town of Göttingen. Despite adding more numbers to the tables he'd been given as a 15-year-old, the primes refused to reveal their secrets.
Gauss's presence in Göttingen transformed this sleepy little university town into the mathematical mecca of Europe. And amongst his disciples was a young mathematician who would make the next great breakthrough in the primes, Bernhard Riemann.
Riemann was born in 1826 in Hanover in Germany, the son of a pastor.
His family was poor, and he himself was a shy child. He didn't enjoy contact with people very much. He was very withdrawn, so he wasn't able to indulge in childhood games and things like that.
The head of his school noticed that this introverted little boy possessed extraordinary mathematical skills. To encourage him, he gave Riemann the freedom of his library with its fine collection of maths books. The library opened up a whole new world for Riemann, a place where he felt at home and in control. Suddenly, here was a perfect, idealised mathematical world where numbers became his friends.
It was in one of the books in his teacher's library that Riemann first read about the problem of the primes. It said that he read the 859 pages of the book in just 6 days, returning it to his teacher with the words, "This is a wonderful book. I know it by heart."
What Riemann had learned would blossom in spectacular fashion just a few years later. Drawn by Gauss's presence, Riemann came in 1846 to the university here in Göttingen. This small medieval town, where the Brothers Grimm wrote many of their fairy tales, hasn't changed much since Riemann's day. But Göttingen was on the brink of a mathematical revolution.
Mathematics had traditionally been seen as a tool for calculation, a servant of the other sciences. In Paris, mathematics built ships and cannons. But in Germany, the subject was changing beyond recognition. Mathematicians were entering a much more abstract, imaginative world, filled with strange new forms of geometry and numbers.
Riemann immersed himself in Göttingen's mathematical revolution. His doctorate introduced a new theory of abstract geometry, which has since been described as one of the most significant contributions to mathematics. Yet, despite his academic success, Riemann still hid himself away. He was a hypochondriac, susceptible to bouts of depression, and he took refuge in his work and behind an increasingly large black beard. It was this strange, introverted character who picked up the baton from Gauss and made the breakthrough that would transform the story of the primes. Riemann suddenly made an amazing discovery. He was working on a mathematical formula called the zeta function. A function is a bit like a calculator. You feed in numbers and a result pops out the other end. Riemann realised that he could use the zeta function to build a three-dimensional mathematical landscape. Like a magical looking glass, the function pulled him from the old universe of numbers into a strange new world of geometry. Riemann stared into the looking glass, took a deep breath, and stepped in. At first, Riemann had no idea that the zeta function was connected to the primes. But on the other side of the mirror, he began to realise that the contours of the landscape created by the formula could unlock the secrets of the primes. Out to the east, the landscape levelled out to a vast flat plain. But as Riemann looked towards the west, a range of mountains came into view. One mountain spiralled dramatically off to infinity. But it wasn't the peaks of the mountains that were important. Instead, it was deep in the valleys between the mountains that Riemann discovered the treasure he was looking for. At key places, the surface of this three-dimensional graph dipped down to height 0, just like points at sea level in a real landscape. Mathematicians call these points the zeros. Riemann realised that these zeros are so important because they have a completely unexpected connection with the way the primes are distributed. A connection which every mathematician who has followed Riemann through the mirror has found totally amazing. It took a huge imaginative leap to establish such a bridge between the universe of numbers and the world of geometry. But Riemann's breakthrough allowed him to dramatically improve Gauss's approach to the primes. Gauss had used the prime number dice to make a guess at the number of primes as you count through the universe of numbers. But it was only a rough estimate, and mathematicians like things to be exact.
Riemann discovered that the precise location of each zero could be used to correct Gauss's guess. For me, it's as if each zero creates a musical note whose vibrations perturb Gauss's guess so that it's closer to the real staircase of the primes.
And it's the combination of all the notes which combine to create a music which corrects Gauss's guess completely, giving the exact number of primes as one counts higher and higher. Remarkably, Riemann had discovered that the zeros, which appear at first sight to have nothing to do with the primes, could actually be used to understand how the primes are distributed.
Riemann's discovery was as revolutionary as Einstein's E=mc². Instead of matter turning into energy, the primes turned into music. Riemann had uncovered the treasure map that held the secrets of the primes. It was these points at sea level, the zeros, that you really have to navigate.
But then Riemann noticed something even more incredible. As he plotted the locations of the first 10 zeros, he noticed an amazing pattern beginning to emerge. The zeros weren't scattered all over the place, but instead, they seemed to be lining up in a straight line running through the landscape. Riemann couldn't believe it was just a coincidence that the first 10 zeros were on this line. He proposed that all the zeros, infinitely many of them, would be sitting on this straight line, the critical line. His conjecture has become known as the Riemann hypothesis.
But what did this amazing pattern mean for the primes? Well, if Riemann was right about the zeros lining up all on this straight line, it would mean that Gauss's guess was far more accurate than even Gauss had imagined. It would imply that the prime number dice were distributing the primes as fairly as possible throughout the universe of numbers.
It proves that there's this great regularity when you look at the primes as a whole. That Gauss, it tells how accurate Gauss's formula is, and it sort of puts the primes in an optimal configuration. It shows that they're balanced in a very beautiful way, in the best possible way.
For me, Riemann's discovery is saying something rather beautiful about the music of the primes.
If all the zeros were on the line, as Riemann proposed, it would mean that there's a delicate balance between all the musical notes emanating from the zeros. But if Riemann was wrong, and there was a zero off the line, then it would be like another musician drowning out the rest of the band. But Riemann didn't believe there was a zero off the line. He was convinced that however far you travelled through the landscape, all the zeros would be on the line, implying that Gauss's guess was always very close to the true number of primes. Riemann's looking glass completely transformed our perspective on the primes. It connected two different parts of mathematics, the zeros in the landscape and the primes. Finding one of these unexpected connections is just about the biggest buzz a mathematician can have.
It's a high.
It feels fantastic.
I think it has to be the best feeling in the world to make a discovery like Riemann did between primes and zeros. To bring together two apparently disparate parts of mathematics and realize that they're talking about the same thing has to be one of the most satisfying intellectual achievements, I think, that anybody could hope for.
Riemann published his discovery in a 9-page paper in 1859. Despite the revolutionary nature of what he was proposing, Riemann was very tentative, saying only that it was very likely that all the zeros would lie on the line. The problem was that Riemann, crucially, couldn't provide a proof. Yet despite this lack of proof, the paper brought Riemann fame and acclaim. He was promoted to the chair of mathematics at Göttingen, the same position that the mighty Gauss had once occupied.
He blossomed out in this time. He had really quite an active social life, and he seemed to enjoy himself. Many mathematicians are quite quiet when they begin in life, and then they open out in later years, and this seems to be the case with Riemann as well.
But Riemann never lived to enjoy his newfound success. War between Prussia and Hanover engulfed the streets of Göttingen. Riemann panicked and fled to Italy, convinced he was going to be shot in the crossfire. But the shock was too much. He died in Italy from TB just 3 weeks later. He was just 39 years old.
Riemann was soon acknowledged as one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. But his reputation may have been even greater had it not been for the actions of his overzealous housekeeper.
Faced with the mess of papers Riemann left in his room, she threw many of his unpublished manuscripts on the fire. We'll never know now quite how close he was to proving his hypothesis. Instead, his ideas have thrown down the gauntlet to future generations of mathematicians. Now it's every mathematician's dream to prove that Riemann was right about the location of the zeros.
Well, the Riemann hypothesis is really the fundamental question, certainly of number theory, maybe of all of mathematics.
Why should a problem be important? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that it's been open for such a long time. Part of it is that it's a very nice, clean statement. Part of it is it relates to these very fundamental quantities, the primes.
Which is incredibly important because it's now an iconic problem. It's like putting a man on Mars or something like that. It's a problem that everyone sees as a testing ground.
By the start of the 20th century, the Riemann hypothesis had become one of the world's greatest unsolved mathematical mysteries. A proof remained frustratingly elusive. But shortly before the First World War, there was a dramatic breakthrough. It didn't happen in Göttingen, but on the other side of Europe.
By the beginning of the 20th century, England had become something of a mathematical backwater. The great universities had remained impervious to the mathematical revolution that had swept through the continent during the 19th century. So it came as something of a surprise to find that the next piece in the prime number jigsaw fell into place here in Cambridge.
The man who awoke England from its mathematical slumber was called G.H. Hardy. He was obsessed by prime numbers all his life. Hardy once declared that tables of primes were better than football reports for light breakfast table reading. But it was another sport that obsessed Hardy. Hardy's passion for the primes was matched only by his love of cricket and by his running battle with God. He desperately wanted to disprove God's existence. But in doing so, Hardy turned God into a major player in his life. On trips to watch cricket, he would take an anti-God battery to ward off any possibility of rain. Even on a sunny day, he'd arrive carrying 4 sweaters, an umbrella, and a bundle of work under his arm. This was to trick God into thinking that he hoped it was going to rain, so that he could catch up on some work. He believed God, his great enemy, would then ensure sunshine to scupper any such plans.
Hardy once sent a postcard to a friend claiming to have proved the Riemann hypothesis.
But the excitement was short-lived. It turned out to be another of Hardy's games with God. He sent the postcard just before a particularly rough sea crossing, as a kind of insurance policy. He believed that God would never let him drown, leaving the world with the impression that he'd actually solved the problem.
Hardy's major contribution to the problem of the primes came early in his career.
Riemann said that there were so many zeros on the line that it is very possible that all of them could be. Hardy showed that there were at least infinitely many zeros on this line, and this was in a way a vindication, at least a part of what Riemann said.
Such a breakthrough sounds as though Hardy had actually proved the Riemann hypothesis. But infinity is a very slippery beast. It's possible to prove that there are infinitely many zeros on the line and still have infinitely many zeros you haven't checked. Or even more worryingly, infinitely many zeros off the line.
Unfortunately, Hardy hadn't even managed to prove that at least half the zeros were on the line. His achievement was extraordinary, but there was still a long way to go. Then one morning in 1913, a letter arrived on Hardy's desk, containing wild, fantastic theorems about the primes. The writer claimed to have a formula that calculated the number of primes up to 100 million with generally no error. If true, this would be a remarkable step forward. Hardy almost threw the letter in the bin. After all, maths attracts its fair share of cranks. But by the evening, the theorems were beginning to work their magic. Hardy realised that the letter had been written by a genius. Even more intriguing, it had been sent from the other side of the world. The author of the letter was Srinivasa Ramanujan, a 23-year-old clerk earning 20 rupees a month working for the Port Authority in Madras. Like Hardy, Ramanujan was obsessed with prime numbers. Instead of attending to the tedious task of keeping the shipping accounts, Ramanujan spent all his waking hours filling notebooks with his calculations about the primes.
After work, Ramanujan would come and walk barefoot along the beach here, still thinking about prime numbers. There was no way he could know about the advances made in the West. Yet miraculously, he managed to rediscover, all for himself, many of the results that Riemann had proved 50 years earlier.
What makes this all the more amazing was that Ramanujan was almost entirely self-taught. He showed precocious mathematical skills while at school in the village of Kumbhakarnam. But his arrogant disregard for any other subject lost him the opportunity of a university education.
It is one of the nice anecdotes which is recalled to us is that he returned the answer script on physiology with the following writing: "This is the undigested portion of the digestion class." This is all that he wrote. And he returned the paper. So he was not interested in other subjects. He was deep into mathematics and he knew he was doing higher mathematics.
Having been rejected by the university in Madras, Ramanujan decided to teach himself. For 5 years, he sat on the porch of his parents' house working on maths.
He thought about mathematics 24 hours a day pretty well. There are even stories that his wife fed him while he was working. They put the food into his mouth so that he could continue his work. There are very, very few people that are this obsessive.
Unconstrained by the usual conventions of mathematics, Ramanujan dived into the problem of the primes with an almost childlike enthusiasm. This naivety would turn out to be his great strength.
The fact that he was self-educated meant that he wasn't contaminated with current thinking, with current prejudices at the time. So he dared to go much further than other people did.
Mathematical creativity is difficult to understand at the best of times, but the way Ramanujan worked was always something of a mystery. He claimed that his ideas were given to him in his dreams by the goddess Namagiri, the Ramanujan's family goddess.
Now that may sound rather strange, but the subconscious plays an important part in the mathematician's creative process. I myself have fallen asleep over a problem and woken up a few hours later with the solution crystal clear in my mind. Ramanujan, it seems, was an expert at letting his subconscious guide him through the mathematical maze.
Desperate to have his talents recognised,
Ramanujan decided to approach mathematicians in England and wrote to Hardy. Once convinced of Ramanujan's brilliance, Hardy became determined to bring the precocious Indian to Cambridge. Ramanujan sailed for England and arrived in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. He soon became a familiar sight around Trinity College, padding around the quad in slippers instead of uncomfortable Western shoes. Ramanujan worked closely with Hardy on many mathematical problems. The pair were hugely successful. Together they discovered brilliant solutions to a number of mathematical problems. But the riddle of the primes defeated them. Hardy warned of their diabolical malice, and the primes refused to reveal their secrets. Ramanujan's genius may well have made the great breakthrough had he not spiraled into depression and ill health. Ramanujan had exchanged mathematical isolation in India for the cultural loneliness of Cambridge.
The times were very difficult. The 5 years when he was there, these were war years. So he was not able to get proper correspondence with his wife. Apart from Hardy, there were not many people with whom who could interact every day.
Ramanujan became so depressed that he tried to throw himself in front of an underground train. The driver managed to brake in time, but Ramanujan was forced to enter a sanatorium, where he was confined for 12 months.
When Hardy visited Ramanujan in the sanatorium, in his rather British way, all he could think to talk about was the number of the taxi he'd just arrived in, 1,729. A rather dull number, Hardy ventured. No, not at all, replied the patient. It is in fact the smallest number that can be written as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. Ramanujan could never stop thinking about numbers.
At the end of the First World War, Hardy suggested that Ramanujan should return to India for a short period of recuperation. Some months later, he was shocked to hear that his brilliant protégé had died at the tragically young age of 33. As for Hardy, he hated getting old and turned all the mirrors round in his rooms so he wouldn't have to look at his ageing face. The problem of the Riemann hypothesis continued to obsess Hardy, but he became more and more disillusioned by his inability to crack it. Like Ramanujan before him, he too unsuccessfully attempted suicide, in Hardy's case by taking an overdose. The Riemann hypothesis was proving a fearsome adversary. On June the 8th, 1954, another mathematician attempted suicide. But this time, the attempt was successful. He didn't take pills or throw himself under a tube train. Instead, he poisoned himself with cyanide. The mathematician was called Alan Turing, and in his quiet way, he had helped Britain to win the Second World War. Turing became famous as one of the mathematicians who cracked the German Enigma code, hastening the defeat of the Nazis. What's less well known is the role the Riemann hypothesis played in helping him to crack the code. During the Second World War, a group of mathematicians were sent here to Bletchley Park to decode intercepted German messages. For Turing and his colleagues, Bletchley was like a Cambridge college, with games of cricket being played on the front lawn. When not busy code-breaking, Turing's mind turned to the mathematical problem he'd been working on before the outbreak of war. It was none other than the Riemann hypothesis. Turing's approach to the problem differed from other mathematicians in two important ways. First, he began to consider the heretical possibility that the Riemann hypothesis might actually be false. Second, he decided to prove it false by adopting a revolutionary tactic. Turing built a machine. The machine would explore Riemann's landscape, trying to prove the hypothesis false by searching for rogue zeros off the line. By the late 1930s,
Turing's room in Cambridge had disappeared under a combination of cogs and gear wheels. But then the war interrupted his work. Turing was posted to Bletchley Park. Although he'd failed to complete his Riemann machine, the work he'd done lay the foundations for the new machine that would crack enemy codes instead.
Turing's machine was wildly successful, shortening the war by at least 2 years and saving countless lives. I don't think it's too far-fetched to suggest that Turing's work on his Riemann machine before the war ultimately paved the way for the defeat of the Germans.
After the war, Turing continued to use machines to solve problems. But his experience at Bletchley had taught him that it was better to build a machine that could be programmed to do a number of different tasks. Built from cathode ray tubes and magnetic drums, Turing created the prototype of the modern computer.
One of the first tasks that Turing gave it was to compute the Riemann zeros. And of course he found that those he could compute all lay on the critical line.
Turing's new machine managed to locate the first 1,104 zeros, but then it broke down. But it wasn't only Turing's machine that was breaking down. His life too began to fall apart.
One of the things about Turing was that he was homosexual, and this cast an enormous shadow over his life. And he wasn't that old when he died, but in his later years he was involved in a very embarrassing court case which was involved with his homosexuality. It's possible that this was what led to his suicide.
Turing's body was found in bed. The autopsy revealed high levels of cyanide in his blood.
What's still something of a mystery is whether Turing intended to kill himself. By his bedside was a half-eaten apple. Had he injected it with cyanide? Perhaps life was imitating art. Turing's favourite scene from his favourite movie was the moment in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when the Wicked Witch laces the apple with poison.
But Turing's notion of a computing machine would live on. He took the first steps into a new age, an era when computers would take over from humans in the exploration of the primes. By 1952, a computer had discovered the first prime numbers beyond the computational abilities of the human mind.
Today, the largest prime number found has over 7.8 million digits. And here it is. If I was going to let this number run, it would take a week and a half for you to see it all. You'll be glad to hear I'm not going to. 7.8 million digits is huge. It only takes 100 digits to express the number of atoms in the universe. That's how ridiculously large this number is. But of course, Euclid proved all those years ago that there'll always be an even bigger prime number out there for computers like this to discover.
And as Turing had first proposed, computers could be used to explore parts of the Riemann landscape that were previously unimaginable.
Just a year ago, it was reported that the first 10 trillion zeros are all in the critical line. That might seem excessive, doing that many calculations about this one thing, but in some sense, the best evidence we have for the Riemann hypothesis is all of the vast amounts of computation that have been done.
If we think of Riemann's line of zeros starting out in Göttingen, then Riemann had got us above the town. Turing then got us as far as the moon. But the computer has allowed us to look 100 light years away from Göttingen. Like a faraway spacecraft, the computer is sending us messages back from the outer reaches of the universe of numbers. And still, all the zeros obey the Riemann hypothesis.
Calculating whether more and more zeros are on the line is all very well, but it's never going to prove the Riemann hypothesis. The computer is no help in understanding the infinite.
nobody knows what might be happening in the far reaches of the mathematical universe. There could be a freak zero hiding out there which has fallen off the line.
As the 20th century wore on, mathematicians began to acknowledge that they were stuck. But then, in the 1970s, there was a major breakthrough in the riddle of the primes, and it came from the most unexpected quarter. The Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton is a haven for the world's leading mathematical and scientific brains. Germany's mathematical heritage didn't survive the ravages of the Second World War, and many eminent Jewish mathematicians fled to America for sanctuary, including Albert Einstein. Since the Second World War, Princeton has taken over as the world's greatest mathematical institution. In 1972, a young American mathematician called Hugh Montgomery spent the day discussing his new ideas at the Institute. But in contrast to his predecessors, Montgomery decided to look at not whether, but how the zeros were laid out along Riemann's line. And he made a startling discovery.
This spacing that I found has relatively few close pairs. It's as if the zeros are trying to push themselves away from each other. You think of little springs attached from one zero to another and compressing and being stretched.
It was observed that the zeros don't like to get too close together. They have kind of a repulsion. So if you plot them on a line, you find that they have a very pleasing to the eye spacing.
At 3 o'clock each day, the academics gather in the common room for one of the important rituals of all mathematics departments: afternoon tea. That afternoon, Montgomery was introduced to the renowned physicist Freeman Dyson.
He very politely asked me what I was working on, and I mentioned this, and he recognized the density at once as being the density of pairs of energy values in random matrix theory.
And what does this cocktail of technical buzzwords mean? Well, this was exactly the mathematics being used to model the energy levels of the nucleus of heavy atoms like uranium.
The energy levels in the nucleus of an atom are very like the different notes played by a musical instrument. As I play my trumpet and blow more energy through it, the notes jump up by degrees. For example, the nucleus of the atom is very similar. As it gets more and more agitated, the vibrations inside the nucleus jump up by degrees, just like the notes in my trumpet.
Physicists had discovered that the energy levels of the nucleus of atoms like uranium like to space out in a uniform manner, just like the zeros on Riemann's line.
What Montgomery and Dyson had discovered was that the fundamental behaviour of atoms, the building blocks of matter, seemed to correspond directly with the fundamental behaviour of primes, the building blocks of maths. The connection was completely unexpected, yet it opened up a whole new way of approaching the Riemann hypothesis.
This connection that Montgomery and Dyson made has been tremendously exciting because it's brought physicists into studying the Riemann hypothesis and led to a tremendous new exciting research that almost certainly wouldn't have happened otherwise, both in physics and in mathematics.
Here was the best hope yet of providing some sort of explanation for the Riemann hypothesis.
Despite these major breakthroughs, a proof of the Riemann hypothesis still eludes mathematicians. The primes retain their mystique. Up till a few years ago, it was probably only mathematicians who really cared about these enigmatic numbers. But a recent turn of events has seen the primes take centre stage in the rough and dirty world of electronic communication.
Every time we make a transaction online, we're using prime numbers to encode our credit card details. The security of the system capitalizes on the difficulty of working out how to crack a number into its prime building blocks. I can show you how it works with the help of two colours of paint. Imagine that each colour of paint is a prime number. If I mix together some of each colour, like multiplying the two primes, I come up with an entirely new colour, or an entirely new number. Now, this new number is used to encode the credit card number. But the only way to decode it is to know the two primes that created this number.
Just as it's very hard to separate the two paints once mixed, it's extremely difficult to calculate the two primes which created the encoding number. But without knowing the original two primes, it's almost impossible to decode the credit card number.
It's such a secure system because we don't yet understand the primes well enough. A proof of the Riemann hypothesis should tell us all sorts of new things about the behaviour of the primes. Perhaps even enough to show us how to find the prime building blocks of large numbers. Such a discovery would cause the online financial world to collapse.
It's perhaps not surprising to learn that a businessman has now offered a prize of $1 million to anyone who can crack the Riemann hypothesis. But mathematicians aren't interested in the money. A solution would have such profound consequences for the rest of mathematics that most mathematicians would sell their souls for a proof.
A great deal of mathematics does assume that the Riemann hypothesis is true, and if it turns out to be false, maybe we have to find a new way to do that mathematics, or maybe some of that mathematics will turn out not to be correct.
We have no idea what the proof of the Riemann hypothesis, what secrets that will unveil to us. And I think we're very hopeful that it'll be something dramatic. It'll basically change the face of mathematics.
But are we any nearer to finding a proof of the Riemann hypothesis? Are we any closer to understanding the strange behaviour of prime numbers? Will the problem ever be solved?
Yes. One has to believe that. Otherwise, one would have to give up.
If a zero were discovered off the line, I think I would quit doing mathematics. It wouldn't really be the subject I thought I was.
I'd love to meet the person who doubts the Riemann hypothesis. I don't know of any person.
I'm not even absolutely sure it's correct. I'm willing to admit a small probability that might even be false.
Nobody knows where the solution is, how deep it lies. I think with all the developments of mathematics recently that I just feel like it may not be too far away.
It could come any time between now and 100, 300 years, but my guess is in the next 50 years. I think I'll probably, hopefully, live to see a proof of the Riemann hypothesis.
After 3,000 years, the riddle of the primes has defeated generations of mathematicians. Personally, I believe that even with these intriguing connections with physics, cryptography and computers, mathematicians are still one big idea away from a solution. That idea might come from anywhere and at any time. But one thing is for sure, whoever does finally crack the Riemann hypothesis will be remembered forever as the mathematician who made the primes sing.
So, Sweet Betsy from Pike is a traditional folk song for which Tom Apostle has provided words pertaining to the Riemann hypothesis. I only know the first verse. Oh, where are the zeros of zeta of S? GFB Riemann, he made a good guess. They're all in the critical line, said he, and the density's 1 over 2 pi log t. That's it.
You can learn more about numbers with the Open University at open2.net.